In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be happening through Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so this conference is on temperance. I'm not going to go into all of the aspects of temperance because I do those in other conferences, but we will at least touch on the ones that I haven't talked too much about. Temperance, of course, resides in the concupiscible appetite, and it refrains the concupiscible appetite by going to excesses, either by excess or defect, in relationship to those things that pertain to the pleasures of touch. So St. Thomas says that its proper object actually is pleasure, but he says it's particularly in relationship to touch. So this would include food, because you've got to touch the food to eat it. And then it also pertains to conjugal relations. So there's those two things that it actually pertains to. In temperance, there's going to be different extremes. So in temperance, is going to be on both sides. The first virtue that's under temperance, so these are all, again, subjective parts. Subjective meaning that you can have temperance. So, for example, you can have the virtue of abstinence and not have the virtue of sobriety, which we'll talk about in a minute. And you can have temperance to some degree without having the virtue of abstinence. Okay. So the first one is the virtue of shame. Now, most people today, because of modern psychology, think that shame is something evil or bad, when in point and fact, shame in St. Thomas's view is there's a virtue, and this virtue is the virtue by which one fears being perceived as lowly. That's the definition of shame. So shame is the fear of being perceived as lowly. Now, this shame plays a particular role in moderating things, especially in relationship to the pursuit of things that are lowly, that is, those things pertaining to the conjugal act, and also those things pertaining to food, so somebody has no shame. You see this today with the whole sexting thing, and also with people's openness about matters that pertain to the Sixth Commandment. They're just very open about those things, and they have no shame about it, right? There's none whatsoever. There's no fear of being perceived as lowly at all. That shame has to be moderated in the sense that it can't be too excessive, where you're having shame about things that you shouldn't have shame about, or you shouldn't be worrying about whether you're lowly in a particular area or what have you. So there's those that have too much shame, and then there's those who don't have any shame at all. And I think that's actually what we see more of today is people have absolutely no shame. I mean, not just in relation to the matters of food and matters of the Sixth Commandment, they also have no shame in relationship to manifesting their ignorance. They'll get up there and they'll just literally start talking, and they don't know, such as I'm doing now, they don't know anything that they're talking about at all, and yet they think that their opinion is just as good as anybody else's in relationship to what they actually think, when in point and fact, they don't have a problem with manifesting their ignorance or their complete lack of logic, or sometimes just they're being irrational. So in other words, people don't have any shame whatsoever today in relationship to certain things. You see this even with politicians. They'll get up and they will lie, bold-faced lie. They even know it's a lie, and they do it, but they don't really care, and they're just they keep doing it because that's the way for them to provide a counter, even though it's not a real one, to what you're saying, just to quieten things down so that they can continue doing the types of things that they want to do. I think the other thing is that there's no shame among the politicians about impugning someone else's character brutally, just as an ends to justify the means. So in other words, there's no shame among the politicians at all anymore. They get caught in things, and they just keep doing it. Another example is the whole, thing about the global warming thing. They get caught cooking the books on the data and yet they continue pushing the same data or different data that we also know is either conflated or false, and it doesn't seem to matter. They can just keep pushing it. So people have no shame, and the shame is an important thing because that fear of being perceived as lowly keeps us from doing things that would detract from our pursuing of a more noble life, magnificence and things of that sort. Okay. So shame is actually a virtue when it's rightly ordered. Next is the virtue of honesty or honestia. It is not translated as honesty. That's truthfulness. Rather, it is the virtue, it's the habit of always seeking to do the virtuous thing in each and every situation. So in other words, it's the person who is, it doesn't matter what he's doing, he's always looking to make sure that what he's doing is in accord with virtue, which is a little bit different from integrity. It's sometimes translated as integrity, but integrity is a negative thing rather than a positive thing. Integrity means that there is nothing lacking in the thing, whereas, so in other words, that a person who has integrity, he never lacks having done the good thing, right? All right, and you can always, when a man has integrity, you can trust him because you know he's going to do the right thing. Whereas honesty is a little bit different. It's the person's pursuit of excellence in each and every area of their life. Okay. The next is abstinence. And this is refraining from eating certain kinds of foods. Just refraining from eating. So and there's a natural virtue of abstinence and a supernatural virtue of abstinence. The supernatural virtue of abstinence, you fast, or you refrain, from certain things for God's sake. Ultimately, to subdue the faculties so that you can come closer to God. So it's ultimately about God. We have the natural virtue of abstinence. I find it kind of interesting that people will complain about the church's abstinence and fasting rules and yet turn around and go on a diet, which is basically the same thing, except the motivation is different. Okay. Next is fasting. This is refraining from food in general. So you just cut down the amount of food, or you cut food out for a certain amount of time. Which, of course, now you're saying you're starting to find the health benefits of fasting, as long as it's done moderately and done in the right way. Fasting as you've probably heard me say this in other conferences, but the current church's rules on fasting suffice, so following those suffice for obedience. It does not suffice for the natural law requirements to develop the virtue of fasting. You only have to fast 2 days a week, or 2 days a year. Well, that's not going to develop virtue. It has to be something that's done consistently. And this is something that people fail to realize, is that if you're going to actually develop the virtue of fasting or reach perfection, because it has to be perfection in all the virtues, you actually have to master fasting at some point in your life. Okay. Sobriety. The sobriety is a virtue that lies in a mean between excess and defect. So, by the way, fasting and abstinence helps us to moderate the food, moderate our concupiscible appetite, so that we're able to eat and fall upon the mean between excess and defect in relationship to food as to quantity or kind. Okay. Sobriety is the virtue by which one has moderate use of alcohol. So, let's be clear about something. Teetotalism is not a virtue, just as drunkenness is not a virtue. Now, if someone doesn't drink alcohol because they just don't like the taste, or there's certain other health reasons or what have you, that's one thing. But if they stay away from it because they think it's evil, like we saw in the Temperance movement, that's not where virtue lies. This also brings up another issue, which is people say, can the parents give alcohol to their kids who are minors? And in Catholic countries, it's consistently yes, in the sense that the Catholics have a right, the church has always recognized that the parents have a right to teach the kid moderation in relationship to alcohol. And they've all, whereas in this country, it's considered illegal, but the law can't derogate from the parents' natural law rights to teach their kid a particular virtue. So technically speaking, they can. Whether practically speaking they want to is another matter. But the sobriety is a matter of between excess and defect, so it lies in the mean. And the mean here is relative to the individual. So St. Thomas always says, as Aristotle and St. Thomas all the way on to the moral tradition, that how much a person eats is relative to them. And so what a guy who's 250 pounds and works a hard job on construction eats is going to be fundamentally different than, say, something what I would eat, or most of us here. Then and it's the same thing with alcohol. Alcohol, different people have different degrees of tolerance, and so they have to drink, some people have to drink a lot less because it affects their reason more than others. And the question that people are asking, well, how do I know that I've committed mortal sin in getting drunk? Well, it's pretty simple. Once you've gravely compromised your judgment about moral matters, then it's mortally sinful. If you drink and get buzzed to the point where it starts, but it doesn't affect your judgment, even about slight matters, then it's not sinful at all. If it does affect your judgment slightly, then it's just venially sinful. Okay, so that's the question that people seem to always have. Usually that's because they've been immoderate and they want to have a sense of, did I overdo it? Right. Okay. Most people today do not know that getting drunk is actually a mortal sin. And the reason, of course, it's a mortal sin is because of the fact that you remove your use of reason, and as a result of that, you've rendered yourself where you can't act morally, and that's grave matter. Okay. I won't go into continence or chastity too much, only because those are things that I've talked about in other conferences. Constancy, of course, is in the will, which one remains steadfast despite the vehemence or tumult of the appetites. Chastity is the virtue in the concupiscible appetite, which refrains it or moderates it in relationship to matters that pertain to the sixth commandment. Virginity, which is one that you don't hear too tight. There's actually a virtue of virginity. It's not just a physical fact. There's actually a virtue in relationship to it. And in fact, people can actually, even if they've physically lost virginity, can actually recoup a kind of formal virginity instead of the material virginity. They can recoup the formal virginity. And this is the habit of mind or soul which always refrains from taking delight, even interiorly, from pleasures associated with the sixth commandment. So in other words, it's that interior restraint in relationship to it. Now that's very important because some people are materially virginal, but they're not formally virginal. So you see these teenagers who, they're just looking to have sex at some point in their career, so to speak, and rather than interiorly refraining those desires, or they're thinking of these impure things, or doing certain impure things, even though their physical virginity might be intact. So on the other hand, you can actually have someone who is, as St. Thomas says, someone who's raped, who, even though their physical virginity has been lost, the formal virginity still remains intact because internally they remain refrained in relationship to it. So this is something that to kind of bear in mind, that today and the other thing is too, is there's no value of virginity today. None. People, in fact, to be virginal, there's something wrong with that, unless you're a little kid or something. But when you get older, if there's virgin, there's an attitude that there's something wrong with that. When in point, in fact, the virtue of honesty, they used to call spiritual beauty, but there's also a spiritual beauty in relationship to virginity in this sense. In the sense that St. Thomas says that when we have a problem with lust, it affects our judgment. And there's a lack of clarity of judgment in relationship to not just matters that pertain to the sixth commandment, but it starts to flood over into various other areas of our lives if we're not careful. When a person is virginal in this regard, it creates in them an intellectual clarity, and as a result of that, a certain spiritual purity that's not had otherwise. So when we look at something that's beautiful, let's just take an example. If you have a woman whose facial features are proportionate and have symmetry and there's completeness and everything, but she's got acne all over her face, right? You're not going to say she's beautiful because there's a lack of purity in the complexion. It's the same. So, and it's the same thing in relationship to the soul. That when the soul refrains from those matters, there's a certain purity as a result of that. That is in the soul, both intellectually, volitionally, even in the lower faculties. And as a result of that, there's a certain beauty to the interior state of that soul. This is one of the reasons why Our Lady's interior beauty was so compelling, is because of her purity, not just in relationship to the 6th and 9th commandment, but just in all matters. Okay. The next one is clemency, or meekness. This moderates the delight, the pleasure we get out of vindication that is pertaining to anger. So instead of, so the person who doesn't have meekness is clemency is the one who immediately tends to, as soon as the person does something bad, they just want the satisfaction of clubbing them over the head, right? There's no sense of what's best for this person or what have you. Clemency, sometimes there's a distinction between clemency and meekness. Meekness is sometimes the refraint of the irascible appetite from pursuing that vindication. Whereas clemency is, even in matters where there is legitimate punishment, that the punishment is moderated. So clemency is sometimes you will loosen the bonds of justice in relationship to the punishment in order to for what's better for the person. And parents know this. They know there's certain times you punish the kid, there's certain times you don't, because if you punish them under certain circumstances, it's going to be bad, and other times if you don't. If you do punish them, it's going to be bad. If you don't, and other times you just don't. So this is something to kind of keep in mind. I'm finding that people today have no clemency at all. You see this in the news media, where, some guy just says some term or does something, and people literally want to put the person to death. You're seeing this with some of these marches, where somebody might say something, and the next thing you know, they're marching, and they basically are demanding this guy to be put to death, or this guy to be taken out and hauled out, and or lose his job, or what have you. And there's a disproportionate understanding that justice, there should be a certain proportion. So it's a sign that the anger is out of control. Okay. Modesty, we're not going to go into all that because of the fact that I've got a whole thing on it. But just to give those virtues, there's modesty proper, which deals with externals, so that you don't draw people into violations of the 6th commandment. Humility, which is a sub-virtue to modesty. Eutrapelia, the virtue of right recreation. Sportsmanship, this is the virtue that regulates one's pleasure, specifically in relationship to play or games. And of course, in sportsmanship, we're not seeing any of that anymore. So guys go into the end zone in a football game and they spike the ball and have to do their 5-minute dance, right? That is a sign of a lack of modesty, but it's a sign of lack of restraint in relationship to the pleasure of having succeeded. And this is something that we're seeing just generally. Also, when people don't win, then they get angry and stuff like that, which is also a lack of sportsmanship. Decorum, the virtue in which one's external suits the person and circumstances. Some of the sins that violate decorum, some of the is when people say things or do things that are completely out of place. Another thing that you'll see is people using profanity and vulgarities. So profanity is not only against justice, specifically the virtue of religion, but it's also against decorum, because your speech isn't being properly moderated. And people get a certain pleasure out of using vulgar terms. It's this, and profane terms. So profane deals with things that are sacred, like the name God, Our Lady, Jesus, things of that sort. Whereas vulgarity is using things that pertain to created things that are base. And so those are the types of terms that people will tend to use today. What most people don't know is they will use what they colloquially call the F-bomb, and people think that's actually worse than when people will use God's name in vain, when it's actually the opposite. Use of God's name in vain is actually worse than the F-bomb. But it's just that our sensitivities in our culture have gotten dysfunctional and disordered. Okay, so that's one of those things that's against decorum. The next is the virtue of silence. This is a virtue which one does not speak unless necessary. It is also the virtue in which one seeks to have interior quiet of the appetites, interior quiet. So it's a twofold virtue. One is it regulates the pleasure in talking, basically. So the opposite of it by excess is loquaciousness. So, whereas there can also be a sin against the virtue of silence when people don't talk when decorum would require it. So you walk into a room, you haven't seen somebody in a while, and you refuse to say hello to them. That's contrary to the virtue of silence. But ironically, and it's also contrary to charity. But that's the opposite is, people just simply talking too much. Okay. I've often said that if a guy walks into a room and he just talks nonstop, there's something effeminate about that. So, but anyway. The virtue of silence, so you don't speak unless it's necessary. Then there's also the virtue in which one seeks to have that interior quiet. So there's also, the virtue is one in speech, but it's also comportment. And basically what this means is and you see this when you go over to Europe. You can go to Europe and be in a room about this size, and there can be 40 people in this room eating a dinner. And I can speak to you at a low tone, and you can hear everything I say. In the United States, you literally have to yell at each other to hear each other in a restaurant most of the time, unless they've got stuff dampening the sound in the restaurants. So Americans, by and large, although we're not the worst, I hear the Brazilians are even worse, that we're just loud and obnoxious. But the other thing is, too, is something which you learn in the fraternity, and I learned in the fraternity, which is something that it takes a bit of doing to get used to. So, which is when you're in the seminary, part of the virtue of silence is you don't make unnecessary racket and noise when you're doing things. And that's in order to create the silence for other people so that they can have that interior quiet, and also for yourself to have interior quiet. So in the United States, we'll just walk in and slam the door. We'll, open up the drawers. We're creating all this racket all the time, right? And that's contrary to the virtue of silence. Okay. And actually, that virtue of silence is one that when someone has it, it's also usually a sign of humility, decorum, and what's the other virtue that it's a sign of? Meekness. There's usually a bit of meekness when a person's mastered that silence. The next is studiosity, which is also part of the virtue of modesty, which we've talked about. Simplicity. This is the last of the virtues, and we'll talk a few about the vices. Simplicity is the virtue in which you do not own any more than you need to. This is the virtue which regulates the externals in relationship to quantity, and sometimes even quality. So, for example, a lot of times I will be talking to people who are of they're well known. They're basically famous people. And so what will happen is they'll say, well, I'm known for this. This is what, should I buy the Rolls Royce, or should I buy a really nice BMW? And with the virtue of simplicity, you still have to fulfill your obligations of your state in life. So they need to have a nice car because that's necessary for them in order to engage in the kind of business transactions that they do. If they show up in a beat-up Volkswagen, it's not going to go well for the impression that people have of them, and as a result of that, they're not going to, they're less likely to be able to pull off the business venture. So I just tell them, well, what you need to do is you need to find out what's the lower end of what's property or state in life, and that's where you need to come in, to the lower end of it. So just buy the BMW and not the Rolls Royce. So there might be certain circumstances where the Rolls Royce would have a place. So like for the Queen of England or something like that. But the point being is that the simplicity is that the quality of the stuff that we have suits our state in life, but it's not too excessive. But it's also quantity. So hoarding is contrary to the virtue of simplicity. And you see this when people will they'll just hoard everything in sight. In the fraternity, they had a practice they recommended, which I thought was very good. And basically the principle is this: if you haven't used it in the last year and you're not going to use it within the next year, get rid of it. And part of this is to keep that detachment in relationship to certain things. But this simplicity, I mean, it's a very simple thing. You have neither no more nor less than you need. Now, need here, St. Thomas says there's a distinction between absolute and relative need. Absolute need is, look, you have to have a refrigerator of a certain size for a family of this size. You can't say, well, we'll just do without a refrigerator because we can, make everything into jerky and do all this. No, there's a certain thing in which you're actually, if you're going to feed your kids properly, you got to have a refrigerator, right? On the other, so there's a certain sense in which there's kind of an absolute need. You need a car if you're going to work, etc., under certain circumstances. On the other hand, there's what they call relative need, and this St. Thomas talks about in the context of decorum. So you could be like the Cistercians and have absolutely no statuary, no pictures, no nothing, right? But for them, the reason they do that is precisely to cut off the internal or the external stimulation of their senses to become more internalized and focused on God. But that's only for the perfect, right? You can only do that in certain circumstances. So St. Thomas says that, like in a house, it's proper to have certain pictures, certain ornaments, certain things that are there in order for the proper decorum of the household, because it creates a very specific kind of psychological atmosphere for people to develop virtue. So it's a relative necessity, even though it's not absolutely necessary. But that's all part of the virtue of simplicity. But you walk into some of these people's houses, and it's just they're the walls are so lined you don't even know what the material of the wall is. One time I walked into this one family's house, and they had a room. It was probably about 15 by 15, and it was literally stacked with toys 3 feet deep in the entire house. Your kids don't need that they don't need that many toys. In fact, it's better off if you have certain toys that will help to stimulate their imagination, things like that, and not overdo it. Okay. So you have to be careful in hoarding. One aspect of that virtue which you see priests sometimes struggling with is in relationship to books. I think you've heard me refer to, there's certain people who suffer from luxuria librorum, which means lust of books. So they have so many books, and basically what that's a sign of is that they're just hoarding. They don't need most of it. They're not going to read probably even a quarter of those books. And so it's one thing, so like in my particular case, I actually about once a year I'll go through my books and weed out the stuff that I don't need. Usually it's stuff people have given me that I'm just like, I'm never going to read this. But there's two components to my library. There's those which I have read and I'm going to read, or I need, which I need for future reference, and then those which are strictly reference books, which I need for the particular research. But that's based upon my state in life. Other people, it's good to have those if you're raising children, certain things, another library, or a sizable library for your family based upon what your the intellectual needs of your children are going to be. Okay. The other thing that's good about a library is it creates an external standard of knowledge. I find it interesting that we live in an age where very few people read, very few people even own any books, at the very time when everybody thinks they know everything about everything, right? And this is, so whereas the books, like about the Catholic faith, this provides the external standard. How well do you know it? Well, does it line up with these particular books that are known to be faithful to the Church's teaching? Okay. Sins against temperance, gluttony, eating to excess. Sometimes it can also be to the extreme where it's not, we're not eating at all. One of the things is too, we have to back up. There is this attitude today, which is Jansenist, that pleasure by nature is evil. The actual definition, I think we've talked about this here, but the actual definition of pleasure is a supervening good that accompanies an action to a well-disposed faculty in relationship to a good object, a well-disposed object. What does that mean? It means that God actually designed that when you engage in certain kinds of activity, that there would be this good that would be layered on top of the activity that would give you pleasure for it, so that it's actually a good thing. Now, that is done in order to make the action easier to perform. So if we didn't get any pleasure out of food, most people would start starving to death because they simply wouldn't eat, right? So we have to get a certain amount of pleasure, otherwise we're just not going to eat properly because most people don't follow reason. So that's part of it. But God also gave it so that the eating would become easier to do, right? That means that the pleasure is good, but the pleasure isn't the end. The food is the end. The nutrition's the end. The actual health is the end of the food, not the pleasure gained from it. And so that's where people get a little bit misdirected. Well, so what happens is that you get people today who think that, pleasure is just evil and you can't pursue it. And that's just simply not the case. St. Thomas says that pleasure is actually necessary not just in order to engage in certain actions well, but he says it's also necessary in relationship to play or recreation in order to recreate your soul so that it becomes refreshed. But if you engage in too much pleasure, then you end up in spiritual dissipation, where spiritually your faculties aren't focused and under control. Okay. So gluttony is eating to excess. So people always ask, how do I know I've committed gluttony? Well, the general principle is, if you've eaten to your point of satisfaction and you know if you take the next bite you're going to start feeling uncomfortable and you take it, then you've committed a venial sin of gluttony. Okay. How do you know you've committed a mortal sin of gluttony? Well, it would be if you're eating a food that's very bad for your health. In fact, I had a relative who could drink no alcohol because it would set off seizures. So he just could never drink alcohol. But so if the food is going to cause a grave physiological effects, then you have to refrain. Or if you eat to the point where you throw up, most theologians think, okay, that's grave matter, right? If you eat to the point where you're yakking, okay. Drunkenness, drinking alcohol to excess. I think that one's pretty straightforward. You've heard in other conferences I've talked about lust and fornication. I think I might even have talked about rape and adultery and incest. These are all sins, specific sins or vices, contrary to chastity specifically, but temperance. Incontinence. Incontinence is the lack of steadfastness because of the tumult of the appetites. In other words, incontinence it's generally speaking considered in the will. So this is technically speaking a potential part of temperance. Potential meaning that it's not actually in the concupiscible appetite, but it's in another faculty, but touches upon the matter of this virtue. So an incontinence means in the will that, intellectually, I shouldn't do X, but then, somebody brings out this, I shouldn't eat the steak tonight. Somebody brings out the steak, and so my incontinence kicks in, my weakness of will kicks in, and so I just fold and then end up eating the steak. Okay. So the incontinence is, and basically what that means is, continence, which is in the will, in which I remain steadfast, is something that builds first. The normal progression in obtaining temperance is, first, the intellect has to see the truth about where the mean lies. That's where prudence comes in. But then the will has to remain steadfast because the appetites are out of control. So in the beginning stages of virtue, to build a virtue, the will just has to impose rule and direction on the moral action despite what the appetites want. Then as time goes on, the appetites will begin to conform, that is, develop virtue. But that imposing of that rule until you gain a certain level of virtue, continence is what's necessary. Okay. Continence is also necessary in this sense. A person can actually have the virtue of chastity or the virtue of temperance or the virtue of fasting and abstinence. But God will allow the person, we see this in the lives of the saints, to be diabolically attacked to raise the level of temptation so that the person's will becomes stronger and that the level of virtue becomes stronger than they would through just natural development of virtue. And so even if you have continence and you've attained these other virtues, God will allow the demons to move the lower faculties in such a way, even though you have the virtue, so that the will becomes even stronger and committed to him. Okay. Anger is usually considered against fortitude by excess, but sometimes it's also listed against temperance in the sense that we get an immoderate satisfaction out of the vindication. Also, the anger can sometimes be the result of temperance also regulates those matters that pertain to sorrow. It was very fascinating when St. Thomas said that actually people who are in the habit of depression and thinking of things that are sorrowful get a delight out of considering the things that pertain to sorrow. And how do you know that's true? You tell them, quit thinking about that. Let's think of some happy thoughts. And you start mentioning happy thoughts. And the person is in pain listening to you talk about happy thoughts. Okay. The other side of it is that they've actually discovered in brain studies that people who suffer from depression and mull over sorrowful thoughts get a pleasure. The brain actually releases a pleasure in thinking about this stuff, right? So there's actually an intemperance in relationship to people who sorrow too excessively. And so this is one of the things that people have to be careful. So this is part of that. It's it's that unwillingness to suffer. But part of it has to do with the fact that in anger, when anger takes over their life, they actually get a certain pleasure out of being offended so that they can mete it out on people. They'll actually go around looking for it. So I call them injustice collectors. Okay. There's an actual mental illness called borderline personality disorder, and that's what they do. They collect injustice. They're constantly looking to collect an injustice from you, because in that way it empowers them, they think, in relationship to you. Cruelty. This is an unmoderate vindication with respect to external actions. So this is somebody who just beats the person too excessively over the head. Pride. Unwillingness to live in accordance with the truth. As I mentioned, we get a certain pleasure out of thinking about ourselves. We also get a pleasure out of thinking about our excellence. I am so excellent. Right? And people get a satisfaction out of that. So so pride is different, though, from that pleasure we get out of that. But it does touch upon it. In other words, when I get a pleasure out of thinking about myself, then I tend to judge myself to excess, and that's what the pride is. The pride is that willingness to judge yourself greater than you actually are. It's a willingness. And it's all intellectual pride is when you think you have too much, that you're smarter than everybody else. But it's that willingness to judge yourself greater than you actually are. And we usually, with people who suffer from pride, at some stage before they develop the vice, there's something there that says, you're not that great, but aren't you so good, right? And so it just gets conflated over the course of time. So it's an unwillingness to live in a life in accordance with the truth, but usually that is about yourself, judging yourself greater than you are. Okay. And that's because when we do that, we get a pleasure out of it, and then that's contrary to temperance. Curiosity, which is also against modesty, which we've talked about. Crudity. This is a lack of etiquette or manners. See, most people don't realize that manners are actually part of a virtue. Everyone thinks, you're supposed to do it just because it's part of charity, Well, that's true. But also, it's a matter of regulating your externals. So, for example, in this country, if you take your food and you just start shoveling it in your mouth and you're chewing with the food with your mouth open, and then at the end of it you let out this great big belch, people would say you have no etiquette, right? Because we don't do that here because people don't want to listen to your lowly functions of burping. And second of all, they don't want to see the food as it's falling out of your mouth, right? So there's a certain sense in which we're supposed to keep that covered. Whereas in France, belching after you eat, I still think this is uncouth. I think it's a lack of modesty. But in France, do as the French do. After you eat a good meal, you're supposed to burp as a sign of satisfaction, as a form of compliment to the cook. So, right? But there's also different other things, like just how you address people, like sir, mister, that type of thing. Today, etiquette's completely dropped. As a priest, I'm old enough now where people just call me sir because they don't know what to call me father. And this is a kind of a common problem across the board. They're trying to be respectful, but they don't have a clue about how to do it. So, and this is why learning the etiquette, even proper forms of address to people, certain things, how you even interact with people on a social level is all governed by a certain kind of etiquette and social standards, which can be legitimate. And so crudity is a vice contrary to modesty, specifically decorum in relationship to those matters. Okay. And then St. Thomas actually talks about, and this is the last vice, immodesty. Just a general kind of immodesty. And this is lack of moderation regarding any external in any way. So this would pertain not just to clothing or things like that, but just doing excesses. So, for example, if you look at Robin Williams when he would do certain skits or certain things, or even Jerry Lewis, the extremes by which they would do certain physical actions were contrary to modesty. We find them humorous, but the reason we find them humorous is because we know that kind of excessive gesticulation is incongruous with the way a person should be behaving, right? And so so sometimes people will go to kind of have that lack of modesty. Another area that I'm really starting to notice, it has to do with language. And part of it, which is immodesty, but a lot of it's decorum. So you'll have people who are, they're in their teens and they're in their 20s and 30s, and they're still talking like they're 15. Or now, and it's kind of become ubiquitous in our culture, where you have people talking in manners that are appropriate to a valley girl from the 1980s. For example, the word like, the fact that we use like, well, it was like this, like. That was all begun by these valley girls in California. That's fine for teenage girls. It's not appropriate for you, and you're 60 years old. Knock it off. Talk like a normal human being. And part of that has to do with the fact that it's contrary to modesty to have eccentricities in your speech, how you walk. That's what St. Alphonsus says in relationship to your gait. Things of that sort. You should walk normally or naturally. So when you see certain guys walking down the street, usually their pants are half hanging down too, but they're all walking really cool looking. That's contrary to modesty, right? And so this is something that you're seeing kind of across the board, because our culture is just descending into every type of vice and every particular facet. Okay. Any questions? That was a load, but... No questions. Yes.
Determine, given our culture, what would be a normal way to act to avoid being...
Well, here's the thing. That's actually a very good question. Reason, St. Thomas says, reason is what we call, reason and will, actually, are what we call universal powers. What does that mean? They're universal faculties or powers. It means that their objects are such that they're universals, like the good in general, the truth in general, and things of that sort. So they're not specifically designed like the lower faculties towards specific things like food and sex or the artist's good, etc. So these are universal faculties. What this means is that when will follows reason, because reason sees the universal true or the good and applies it in the concrete, what happens is as I develop the virtue, my faculties become subordinate to reason, which means that they start losing the eccentricities that are proper to vices. And there's a certain naturalness, because virtue is natural to us as human beings, as part of the natural law. There's a naturalness that takes over our interaction with people. Okay. So basically, on one level, you can say legitimately that the way that you would have normal interaction with people is always in accord with virtue. So anytime you're dealing with somebody, having that naturalness. And I find that even in our culture, that naturalness especially among clergy, it makes them very approachable to people, because when a priest has eccentricities, people are a little nervous to go talk to him, right? Either because they don't like the guy, or the eccentricity they find annoying, or they're just not sure how the guy's going to react. Whereas there's a certain naturalness to us. I'm sure you've seen the movie Bernadette. Yeah. There's the one scene where the priest asks Bernadette about Our Lady's mannerisms, and she says, "Oh, she was very so natural." In other words, there's a naturalizing effect in relationship to when you're following virtue, and so that you can actually have an appeal to anybody. The one person there's only one type of person you're not going to be able to have any kind of normal interaction with, and that's the person of deep-seated vice, because they're going to find your naturalness annoying. But that you can't regulate yourself in relationship to him, right? So basically, that interaction should just be, as you develop virtue, it should just be a certain kind of naturalness. Now, that naturalness, you have to remember, can only occur when we have virtues and all the faculties, but that also means we don't have any defects. Because when we have defects, that's when the naturalness of our interaction with people begins to break down. But the defects are actually moral, but they can also be psychological. And by this I mean in the sense that people who are wounded have a hard time having a natural interaction with other people, because they're worried about getting hurt, they're protecting themselves. Very often they're overly kind or overly nice. So, because I know one of my formal spiritual directees was this way. She was just overly nice about absolutely everything, and it was in order to kind of protect herself, right? And so we have to be willing to two things we have to be willing to do is to have that naturalness in relationship to other people. One is we have to be healed ourselves, but the other thing is we also have to be willing to be wounded. We have to be vulnerable in relationship to other people. In other words, if I'm not going to be vulnerable in relationship to other people, what am I going to do? I'm going to put the wall up. I'm going to keep my distance. There's going to be certain kind of formalities that aren't appropriate at the time. And so, whereas there are certain formalities at other times that virtue would dictate. So we have to heal. But then the other thing is we have to be willing to accept the fact that in our natural interaction with people, some guy's just going to stick a knife in us. I mean, that's just the nature of it, right? And we just have to be willing to suffer that. And that's all part of the spirit of mortification. But that's where I think that Our Lady excelled, is because of the fact that she was willing to be wounded, in relation for the sake of our good. So these are the things we have to remove. So if you remove your defects and you just have virtue, then there will be a certain naturalness that will just automatically take over. In the discussion of this universal in faculties, so the eccentricities begin to dissipate. Now, we tend to think of personalities in terms of the eccentricities, generally, and sometimes they're perfections, but they're eccentricities, which is one of the reasons why, when you go through a stage of perfection, like if you're sanguine, you're going to start out with a lot of concupiscence, that'll get moderated, then you usually go to anger, then from there you usually go to sorrow, and then from there you go to being phlegmatic, where there's insensibility, which is also against temperance. And then eventually you end up in the middle, right? So that you end up in the middle where, because of the virtue, you've universalized, you have all the perfections of all of them, but none of the defects of any of them. When people reach that state, that means that, and this is one of the reasons why angels, the good angels, are so difficult for us to get a grasp of their personality. It's so regulated by reason and the universal good that there's no eccentricities about them. The only difference is the distinctions of their task, which determines certain aspects of the personality. Whereas demons have chosen certain defects, they've chosen certain evils, and as a result, their personalities are much more pronounced to us as human beings. Okay. Why am I going into this? Because what happens is, as you gain virtue and you reach that certain naturalness, then you end up like Christ. Christ didn't have any personality traits that were eccentricities. You can't put him under psychoanalysis because he defies it, because he's so perfect that it's all universal. Okay, this was actually what Romano Guardini was talking about in his book that he wrote in the 60s when they were trying to put Christ under psychoanalysis. I'm like, really? But the point being is that there's kind of a universal, and so as a result of that, you can be what St. Paul says, all things to all people. You can fit in with anybody, and that's why Christ is so perfectly approachable, because of the fact that he doesn't have these eccentricities. He doesn't have a personality in the sense that we do. So, because he's so, but on the other hand, because of that, he's so perfectly approachable. Does that make sense? Did I answer your question?
Wow.
Okay. Yeah.
So what you just said about be all things to all people, it's a little bit off topic maybe, but and it might be my interpretation of what that means for clergy or whatever, that sometimes you see excesses in how they react or interact to try to attract people to the faith or whatever.
Yeah. And people know that. Even the people who they're trying to attract know this guy's acting over the top, right? The other thing is that being all things to all people, what St. Paul was basically talking about is the fact that you should be able to, you shouldn't have any defects, and you should be of sufficient virtue that you get to the point where you can be in any group of people and pretty much fit in, any normal group of people and fit in. And that also means that, you should, when you're dealing with people, talk to them about what their interests are. You should be able to have certain conversations about at least some elementary discussion with them about in relationship to the areas of their expertise. That also means that knowledge itself is a good thing, right? And so one of the signs of someone who's reached perfection is that they will actually have a desire. It doesn't mean they seek it, because their state in life may be such that they don't have the time to do it, but they would actually have a desire to know all things about all things in order to know the perfections of God. And so technically they should have an interest in a variety of different areas, not just, the one particular thing, like petroleum engineering or something. They should be able to have an interest in everything from medicine to philosophy, theology, across the board. Okay.
The situation being all things to all people. Let's say you're in a situation and, one guy's living with a girl and they're not married, that kind of thing. They know him a deacon or something. You go to talk to him and it's kind of like, you can tell the wall goes up and, and then they'll give you like one-word answers, very uncomfortable. How would you? What are you supposed to do?
I think there's two parts of it. It's how the priest carries him or the deacon carries himself. So in other words, how you carry yourself, that if they understand from your comportment that you're not out there to beat them over the head. The second thing is being that all things all people, you have to find out what their interests are, what they do. What do you do for a living? What do you think of this? In other words, as human beings, the way we discover, angels don't have this mechanism in their psychology. They immediately, by having intellectual union, by conceptual union, by thinking of the same they immediately know everything there is to know about each other. They don't need to break the ice. So, whereas with us, we have to. In order for me to know that I should trust you, I have to do what? I have to engage in small talk to see, is this guy acting on a rational plane? Yeah. Is he evil? Is he out to get me? And so as on the natural level, you first have to break the ice by talking about stuff that's not that important, just to kind of get a sense of where this guy is at, so that you can know, okay, now I can trust this guy because I realize he's not going to be, if I start talking about theology, he's not going to just pull a gun out and blow my head off. Mm-hmm. Right? So initially you have to talk. That's why a lot of times I'll be in situations, and what I'll tend to do is find out from them what their area of interest is and talk to them about their area of interest, and then that will open up the door to being able to talk about other matters. So, yes.
Well, in the Legion of Mary, I just joined it recently, and
Mm-hmm.
they've been going to the Kennesaw State University campus and talking to people about faith and things. And I was just wondering, when you're in a situation where, you don't have that much time to kind of convey the faith.
Correct.
To people, how do you do that in a way that?
Well, the circumstances are going to determine the decorum. So you're in an intellectual environment, you should be able to strike up an intellectual conversation with people fairly quickly.
Yeah.
If you can't, then there's something wrong there. So I mean, I think it's legitimately, you can just say, you know, hey, we'd like to talk to you about X, right? I mean, if you're on a university campus, you should be there seeking knowledge. And that means that people are going to approach you with different views, and you've got to take a look at it. So, no other questions? Okay. If you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Deum omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et semper. Amen.